Robert Snorri, David Hatcher Childress. David, did you want to finish your last thoughts before we move into the Olmecs at all?
Well, yeah. We were talking about how the Brazilian Navy had discovered these Roman shipwrecks off of Rio de Janeiro. But what happened in the end there, with this exciting archaeological discovery, was it became politicized, and that suddenly the Italian community in Brazil were saying, "Oh, well, hey, Romans discovered Brazil, in fact, and in fact they should all get, citizenship or whatever." And so what happened was the Brazilian government ordered the Navy to go out there, and they buried these Roman shipwrecks rather than excavate them. So that's how kind of things become politicized. I thought it was interesting, also your commercial about gold, and we were talking about how the Egyptians and King Solomon and these guys, they went around the world looking for gold. Gold is indestructible. All the gold of ancient times still exists today. To the ancient peoples, including the Egyptians and the Olmecs, the ancient Israelis, it was gold. It was what really mattered to them. They were also searching for jade was very valuable to them, exotic feathers.
Even if Zechariah Sitchin's right, the Anunnaki came here for gold as well.
That's right. That is part of, his whole cosmology, that the Anunnaki came to our planet. They're looking for gold. Ancient peoples have always sought after gold. And in fact, in Peru, and this is one of the ideas, too, that the ancient land of Ophir that the Egyptians and the King Solomon and the Phoenicians were going to was Peru. And in Peru, gold was so plentiful there in ancient times and right up to the times of the Spanish conquest that the Peruvians actually used gold as like wallpaper. And the big temples and things like that in Cusco were lined with beaten gold. They had gold goblets and plates and everything like that. It was for the Spanish, they went there and said, "Hey, just give us all of your, dish pans and stuff like that." Well, and they just took them, and the Incas said, "Yeah, sure, have them," and it was gold. But you see, it's kind of interesting. If in ancient times the King Solomon's navy and whatnot had traveled through the Red Sea, out through the Indian Ocean, and this is what the Bible says they did. Just how far they went is the question. But they could have easily have gone out then right between New Guinea and Australia, out into the Pacific. Next stops would have been Fiji and Tonga. From there, you would hit to Tahiti and the Marquesas, and then you would land in Peru. And if you got to Peru, man, you could easily fill up your ship with gold, which is what the Bible says they did, and then head on home. It was a 3-year journey. So this is kind of what they were looking for. This is what the Egyptians were looking for in the Southwest. They were exploring. The Chinese, too, were doing similar things. And, in fact, there's been a number of pretty interesting books written just in the last few years about the Chinese circumnavigating the globe before Columbus, a lot of early voyages and things like that. And it's back to what I said earlier, how oceans are highways, not barriers. I mean, it's really unscientific for mainstream archaeologists to insist that ancient people couldn't get into boats and cross oceans. A couple of years ago, a French guy swam across the Atlantic Ocean. How about that? I mean, people have crossed the Atlantic in kayaks, small rowboats. Young teenagers have circumnavigated the entire world by themselves in small yachts without GPS or any of that stuff. So, I mean, and that's part of the enigma, too, was that the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Chinese, the Phoenicians, Romans, they had huge ships, gigantic ships that held 300 or 400 people. In Tonga, they had giant ships like that, too. that were going. I mean, they were much bigger than any ships that Columbus had. You now get into things like the Piri Reis map and the maps of the ancient sea kings by Charles Hapgood.
Oh, yeah, that map is incredible.
Well, right, and it seems that even like Columbus and other people, they had some of these old maps, and they were kept secret too. This was one of the things about a lot of the ancient sea routes and things like that. They were kept secret. The Phoenicians kept secrets. The Phoenician sailors were not allowed to talk about where they went and the ports that they went to. There's a certain a theory that, and I also go for this, that the Toltecs, whose capital was Tula in northern Mexico, they're related to a lot of the stuff here in Arizona. They conquered Chichen Itza in the Yucatan at one point. The Toltecs are depicted as guys with thick beards and mustaches. They wear helmets. They carry swords and shields. They look like Phoenicians. They look like Mediterranean warriors and stuff.
Persians, everything like that.
Stuff like that, right. And in fact, it seems that probably the Toltecs were some offshoot of the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, who had already a transatlantic trade. Another similar thing there is the Phoenicians were known as the purple people, and they wore purple robes. And even the whole concept today of kings and queens wearing purple gowns and purple crowns and things like that, that comes from the Phoenicians, who all wore purple. And that purple color was a very special dye that they got from a shellfish. And that was a secret technique of taking this dye. Phoenicians were famous for it, and the Carthaginians were also Phoenicians. But also the Mayans used also this purple dye, this same unusual shellfish dye, which the Phoenicians had a secret. Another curious thing along this line with the Egyptians and stuff is boomerangs. We think of boomerangs as being some kind of Australian Aboriginal
device.
thing.
Yeah.
But boomerangs have been found all over the world, and in fact, the Egyptians hunted with boomerangs. King Tut, in his tomb in Egypt, there was a trunk full of boomerangs that was found in his tomb. It's part of the Tutankhamun treasure, and in fact, if you go to the Cairo Museum and you go to the Tutankhamun area, you will see on display all of his boomerangs. And he was a boomerang nut. I mean, he didn't just have a couple of boomerangs. He had a whole trunk full of dozens of them. It's well known that the Egyptians hunted with boomerangs. But if you go also down to museums like the Mexico City Museum for the Aztecs and Zapotecs and Toltecs, you'll also see boomerangs on display there. And the Hopi Indians, who live here in northern Arizona, near the Grand Canyon, they supposedly were the keepers of this secret Egyptian city in the Grand Canyon. And the Hopis also hunt with boomerangs, and they were famous for that. Prior to the Spanish conquest, that's what young Hopi warriors did. They went out with boomerangs and hunted birds and rabbits and things like that.
All right, let's talk about the Olmecs if we can. Who were the Olmecs, David?
You know, the Olmecs are a very recent civilization to us. Prior to really 1940, the Olmecs were completely unknown. Up to that time, the archaeologists believed that the oldest civilization that was in Central America was the Mayans. And the Mayans went back to, at that time, they were saying, well, the Mayans went back to, say, 500 BC, 800 BC, something like that. Well, what happened was, in the 1930s, art experts in the United States began realizing that there was this style of art coming out of Mexico that was totally unique, and it wasn't Mayan, and it wasn't Aztec or Zapotec or Mixtec. It was this very unusual and distinctive kind of art, statues, jade artifacts, things like that. And this is how they found the Olmecs. And the look of the Olmecs is very curious. The most famous things of the Olmecs are what we call the Colossal Heads, these gigantic basalt heads. They weigh 20 tons, and they look like Nigerian rugby players or something. They're wearing helmets. They look very, very African. They have the typical Negroid wide nose and thick lips. When you see these guys, they don't look like Mayans. They look extremely African, although some Olmecs also look very Oriental. They look very Chinese. Even other Olmecs have beards and mustaches. They look more like Mediterraneans, Phoenicians, and things like that. So in 1940, what happened was the archaeologists in Mexico had a special conference, and they called archaeologists from all over the world. And at that time, they gave them all this evidence for the Olmecs. They said, yeah, there's this other culture that's older than the Mayans. It's older than every culture that we can find in Central America. And in fact, this ancient culture that now we're going to call it the Olmecs, the rubber people, they're the ones who, in fact, created the calendar. They created the number system. They created the ball game. Many of the early Mayan cities, like those, like Huacatán, deep in the Petén jungles of Guatemala, they're saying now that, yeah, that was originally an Olmec city, but eventually became a Mayan city. The Olmecs themselves go back, they're saying, to about 1,500 BC. The Olmecs are characterized by, again, this really unusual facial features. They often have this frown. They look like they're Africans. And they have the cone heads. In my book, Mystery of the Olmecs, there's a lot of pictures of these guys, and they're really strange looking.
Are they from this planet?
Well, boy, when you see some of these guys, and they're heavy, elongated heads, I mean, for whatever reason, they have either bound the heads as babies, or else they naturally look like this, but their cranial capacity is like double that of a normal human.
Yeah.
And people look like this all over the world. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, Egyptians did this as well. Tutankhamun himself was also what we'd call a cone head binding. Then the dolicephalus is the technical term for that, where you have an elongated cranium. I have a whole chapter in Mystery of the Olmecs about this, and the more you look into this whole thing of head binding, of shaping these long conehead craniums, the weirder that gets. Because
I'm not sure that they made these. These look like they're genetic mutations, or they came from someplace else.
When you see them, they look like aliens, and so that's been I think a natural assumption, because when you see some of these skulls and the figurines and things like that come out of Mexico, also South America, yes, you're right. I mean, they look like they're extraterrestrials. I mean,
look at the size of the eye sockets, David. They're huge.
Well, that's right. And, I mean, these are not the kind of guys you're going to want to meet in a dark alley. I mean, they look like something out of, like, these alien movies or something like that. And, in fact, that Swiss artist, Geiger, who created that kind of look, of these long-headed, sort of, sort of insectoid aliens in that movie. But that is what these guys look like. And when you show photos of just your typical Olmecs, they're some weird-looking guys. I mean, you can hardly believe it.
Are you familiar with Lloyd Pye's work in The Star Child?
Yes, I am. And
very similar skull.
Well, right, and his skull, and I've been privileged to examine the Star Child skull myself. I've met Lloyd a couple of times, and that is a really unusual skull. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, where you have these really strange skulls. Some are smashed sideways, kind of, like his Star Child skull is like that. And there are, you will see particularly in Mexico and in Peru, you will see in museums some of these skulls, and some are really shocking to see. They're just so bizarre. We don't know why people did that. Now, it may be that some of these people really were extraterrestrials. That's just how they naturally looked. We know that, at least in some cases, the Olmecs and the Mayans and people all over the world, in fact, were doing this, including the Kurds in northern Iraq, the Egyptians in Malta, they were doing this. People were, somehow they would shape young babies' skulls like this, at least in some cases. When you are still an infant, you have plates in your head, and they haven't fused yet. They're to allow your head to grow bigger, but eventually as an adult, the plates in your head do fuse together. Prior to that, you can work with the head. And we know that in some cases people did this.
But can you make it that large? And what about the eye sockets? How do you make your eye sockets twice as big as a normal human?
Well, that's a good question. With the deformation of these skulls, it would deform the eye sockets too, and even it would have been a problem in some cases, you would think, for that their heads would have become so heavy, and the back of their heads are extended like twice as far as ours. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you see these weird skulls like this, that would have been even hard for them just to hold their heads up. If you look at statues of Nefertiti, of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, their daughters, Meritatan and Meketaten, they also have these really weird, elongated skulls. I mean, maybe they were extraterrestrials too, and that has been suggested, of course. But there are ways. I mean, maybe they were trying to copy these extraterrestrials, or they were...
Right, that's possible.
Right. Some of these people probably were humans, and...
Or maybe hybrids?
Hybrids, right? And and I know Zecharia Sitchin too, and I'm familiar with his work. It's quite interesting. I do disagree with him on a number of things, but the idea that these Anunnaki, some aliens are here, that they look like this. Extraterrestrials don't necessarily look a whole lot different than we are, and in fact, perhaps we are extraterrestrials too, in that sense. But with these elongated skulls, this was really a hallmark of the Olmecs. And also a special frown that they had. There were certain looks. There was a V cleft also in their heads, like they actually had, at least they depicted this kind of a cleft right at the top of their head. The Olmecs did all kinds of weird stuff, including tattooing, piercing. They had mohawk haircuts. A lot of the weird stuff that we do today, they were doing back then. And it kind of shows you, there's nothing new under the sun. But a lot of these weird Olmec characters, except for the really elongated heads, they would almost look like a modern guy walking down the streets of Los Angeles or something.
Hey, David, when we come back, let's talk about the kind of technology that they might have had. And also, you've done some work on lost cities. What about Atlantis? I got to talk with you about that, too. We'll be back in a moment. David Hatcher Childress, our guest on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest, David Hatcher Childress. Next hour, we'll open up the phone lines. But I've got more to talk with him about when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. David, can we speculate on what kind of technology the Olmecs had? What do you think?
Well, yes. One of the strange things that the Olmecs did was carve these giant heads out of basalt, and they weighed 20 tons. The basalt is extremely difficult rock to carve. It's so hard. So you have to look into that. The whole thing of moving giant megalithic blocks around, the Olmecs did that. Mexico does have megalithic cities, such as Monte Alban and Mitla, also La Venta, the center of the Olmecs. So one of the things that we look at, and say with the Olmecs, with the Egyptians, ancient India, Atlantis, and whatnot, is what ancient people are able to do. And if you are able to quarry a 100-ton block of granite or basalt, move that 20 miles, stack it up in a giant wall, places like Baalbek, Peru, Mexico, certain Pacific islands. I mean, you're in Egypt, of course. What you're doing is something that even modern construction companies wouldn't do today. It's kind of the way we look at the past. And this was in my book, Technology of the Gods. This was the subject I tackled was, okay, we perceive ancient civilizations as being primitive. The way that modern historians paint the past to us is, well, 8,000 years ago, people were cavemen, very primitive. Then suddenly they just stepped out of their caves, started building ziggurats and pyramids and things like that. And lo and behold, here we are, modern man with all of this cool stuff that we have. But really, the ancient civilizations weren't like that. There's a roller coaster of ups and downs. That's what the graph of history would read. We would have times of enlightenment and science, these golden ages of legends. But then there have been crashes, and this happened with the Olmecs too, where suddenly these guys are moving giant heads around, they're carving huge statues, then moving giant blocks around. You see this, say, in Peru, and then suddenly it all just stopped. Some cataclysm just halted all the workers. They left huge blocks the size of a semi-truck just lying on roads and things like that. They were never made it to the giant wall or something that they were making. In Technology of the Gods and in all my books on lost cities, what I try and point out is that people would not be building, like the Olmecs, with giant blocks of basalt or granite. I mean, some of these things weigh 100 tons. The giant blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon, these weigh 1,000 tons. 100,000 tons, which would be 200,000 pounds. Even modern cranes wouldn't try and lift and move these blocks, yet ancient people were doing that. And you have to ask the question, why would the Olmecs or the ancient Peruvians or other people on these Pacific islands and stuff, why would they want to go around and build with 100-ton blocks, 20-ton blocks? It seems incredible. They don't have to build like that.
Right.
I mean, we don't do that today. We don't. Construction companies don't go around hauling around 20-ton blocks and stacking them up, maybe for the Lincoln Monument or the Jefferson Memorial or something like that. So you have to ask yourself, I mean, and this is what, say, Zachariah Sitchin would do, Eric Von Däniken, myself, Graham Hancock, and that is, why are they doing this? It's because they've apparently chosen to do something so incredibly hard. Even today, we would find it so difficult with all of our modern equipment. Yet they were trying to do that. It would seem that somehow they were able to do these things easier than us, and that what seemed so incredibly difficult was easy for them. I mean, it's like they had to have some kind of anti-gravity, some sort of levitation device that made these stones weightless. This island that I was talking about earlier, Nan Madol, on Ponape Island in Micronesia, the legend of that island, this city built of 150 million tons of basalt and 100 artificial islands in the ocean. The legends on that island are that those stones flew through the air. And in fact, archaeologists don't even know where they got all of the basalt that they used in this city. It's like entire mountains of basalt would be dismantled to create the city of Nan Madol. And the natives are saying, yeah, the stones flew magically through the air, some kind of a levitation, stacking these things up. when you see the huge walls like at Ollantaytambo in Peru, Tiwanaku as well in Bolivia, stuff in Egypt and Baalbek, what we're talking about, there's plenty of other places. When you see that, I mean, it only makes sense that they could have somehow made these huge stones weightless. NASA has even done experiments like that of acoustic levitation and stuff like that. Sound waves can make things lose weight. They're constantly doing studies like this. They had to have something like that. In my book, Technology of the Gods, I actually go into a whole chapter about Vimanas, that they had ancient aircraft. When you read
That's an incredible story. You talk about that for a little bit, David, okay?
Sure. When you read the ancient Hindu epics, the Mahabharata, part of that is the Ramayana, they read like the wildest science fiction.
They really do, yeah.
And Rama, these ancient Hindu kings and other people, they get into these airships. They're called in Sanskrit Vimanas. In ancient Hindu epics and stuff, they talk about these a lot. Rama, in the story of the Ramayana, this is all supposed to be 10,000 years ago or more. His wife runs away from him. He goes into the Ayodhya forest in northern India, meditates for a while. He's bummed out because his wife left him. Then after a couple of years, he actually, decides, I'm gonna go get her back. He gets in his Vimana, this aircraft. He flies to Sri Lanka, battles with this Ravana guy who's stolen his wife. He gets her back, takes her back to northern India, all in his Vimana and these airships. Also, in the Mahabharata, they talk about these airships fighting battles. Their horrific wars are fought. Entire cities are just decimated by the weapons in these craft. And then, in fact, an entire book was discovered in ancient India about Vimanas. When you read some modern novel where the hero, James Bond, gets onto a British Airways flight, flies to Switzerland or something, the author's not going to suddenly stop and tell you what an airplane is and describe it and how airplanes work and all that kind of stuff. They know that you know, so all they have to do is just mention an airplane, and you know what they're talking about. And that's how the ancient Indian epics were too. They talked about these Vimanas, these airships, but they didn't go into great detail about them because they knew that you knew what they were. Finally, in 1908, this ancient book from the 4th century BC called the V Monica Shastra was found in this library in India, and it said that it was a book taken from older books and that it was all about Vimanas. And it talked about different kinds of Vimanas. They were these metal craft. It talked about propulsion. Mercury was part of it. It talked about electricity. There was even stuff about the weapon system and stuff like that in the V Monica Shastra. There weren't any illustrations, and it was basically an archaic Sanskrit. Then modern Sanskrit scholars were translating it. And this, in India, this is a popular subject. Every single Hindu or Buddhist in India knows what a Vimana is, knows the stories. They're familiar with that whole story. Now, what happened then? British and Indian and Pakistani archaeologists began excavating these cities out in the Thar Desert between India and Pakistan right after World War II. These were just cities out in the desert, and in fact, they were made out of fine brick. They discovered them because they were looting brick from these cities to build some of the railroads in Pakistan. When the British archaeologists got to the city streets in the late 40s in these excavations in India and Pakistan, people were just lying dead in the streets, just like the ancient Indian epics had said. This doom had taken over cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Kotdiji, and it was, as the ancient Indian epics had talked about, these horrific wars, these cities were devastated, and that's what they discovered. People were just lying dead in the streets. And they found these melted glass blobs that turned out to be melted ceramics. Some superheat had also destroyed these cities. It was like kind of like atomic devastation. And in fact, no one came and buried the dead or anything. The dead people just lying in the streets. Then the desert came in, covered them with sand, and for thousands of years, these cities just sat there until the excavation in the 40s. It's an interesting thing here, too, George, is that...
It is fascinating stuff, David.
Well, and what's important about, say, the ancient Indian epics, Vimanas, ancient India itself, throughout history, knowledge and libraries have been destroyed. There have been great libraries in Egypt, in China, also in Mexico, and all over the world. The library at Alexandria held hundreds of thousands of volumes on history and science and technology and stuff like that. All those books were destroyed, like the 3rd century A.D. The Emperor Qi Huangdi of China, the same emperor who built the Great Wall and has the terracotta warriors that are so famous, he ordered every book in China destroyed, like 500 B.C. The Spanish, when they conquered Mexico, they gathered all of the Mayan codexes, the hieroglyph books of the Mayans, and destroyed them all. There's only 4 known Mayan books still in existence. So throughout history, I mean, this is one of the problems with trying to piece together what's happened. History's been purposefully destroyed, where the dictator of the time literally orders all books destroyed so that history will start again with them. India is one of the few countries where there's really still a continual line of knowledge and language going back thousands of years. And this is with the V Monica Shastra book. Sanskrit scholars today can still read these really ancient books. But that is unique. In ancient Egypt or in China and places like that, I mean, they have some early hieroglyphs and scripts, but people cannot read them. So,
Michael Cremo thinks we are hundreds of millions of years old. I'm beginning to think he may be right.
And that's in his books, too, and I know Michael Cremo, and also in my book on Technology of the Gods, you look at some of these unusual artifacts. I mean, there's metal objects, chains, metal balls, and things like that. And here in North America, there's been a number of stories like that, where it's your typical lump of coal kind of story, and inside of it is a nail or a gold chain or something like that. And, of course, when geologists are saying, well, all this stuff's millions of years old. I mean, that lump of coal is millions of years old. Some geological formation that they blasted out. Yeah, I mean, and so, I mean, if that's the case, if everything really is, millions and millions of years old, then when they find artifacts that are man-made or artificial in some way, I mean, that's an indication that mankind or some other race was occupying this planet, before we got here. There's a strange story, too, George, that you might know about, which was in Wyoming in the 1930s. They were blasting out this cliff, and inside a cleft in this cliff was this miniature person, and he was in solid rock. And there's photographs of this guy too, and he's called the San Pedro mummy. He's about 2 feet tall. He was mummified. He was inside this cliff,
fully developed.
Fully developed. Yeah, I mean, there are photographs of this guy, even X-rays. But where? And he's another missing artifact, as a matter of fact, and one where we actually have photos of it. And it was studied briefly, but where that San Pedro, Wyoming mummy is today, no one knows. It just disappeared.
And again, it's part of the mysteries of the ancients. And we're running out of time. I want to talk with you about Atlantis next hour as we take phone calls. Let's touch again on the possibility of ancient atomic wars. You know, again, the Vedas point out explosions, mushroom clouds. It had to have happened.
Well, I have a whole chapter in Technology of the Gods about ancient atomic warfare. It seems so incredible. Just that the ancients would have machines, that you would have to have electricity, machining tools, power tools. You're going to have aircraft, much like we have today. They apparently had UFO type craft, actually flying discs, tubular-shaped craft. And the idea then that they fought these horrific wars, this is what the Ramayana and the Mahabharata were talking about. And, there really is evidence for this. Out in the west part of Egypt is this huge field of glass. This is right where, if you've got a map where Egypt and Libya and Sudan all come together, that area is uninhabited desert. It's just sand dunes and flat sand. In the 1930s, as British archaeologists and geologists went out into that area, and they're driving Land Rovers and stuff just through the desert, what they found was that for miles around in that area, there were just huge sheets of glass. And it wasn't until really the first atomic test at Alamogordo in New Mexico, where they detonated the first atomic bomb during World War II, and that, of course, did exactly the same thing. It turned the desert around Alamogordo to sand, white sands, that area they call it. So there's certain areas of the world that have also been turned to sand, but it's happened in ancient times. So, naturally, archaeologists and geologists, the idea that there was somehow some atomic warfare that, just like today, turned areas of the desert into basically sheets of glass. They just can't accept that. That just can't possibly be the answer. So therefore, they have to search for other answers. In the case of the sheets of glass out in the Egyptian desert, their explanation is that some kind of comet or asteroid came screeching across the Sahara, melted the desert, turned some of this glass, turned the sand into glass, but there's no impact for this comet or asteroid. So it somehow just kind of skimmed along the surface of the Earth, turned sand into glass, and then, went back out into outer space or something like that. So you're looking, it's looking at the past in a different way and trying to make sense of the legends, the myths, and the evidence that we can see.
Stay with us, David. We'll take phone calls. We'll talk about Atlantis next up. Hey, David, before we take calls, let's talk a little bit about Atlantis and the possible connection of Mount Shasta. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. I do mention that a little bit in my Lost Cities of North Central America book. The whole idea, too, of ancient civilizations having some pretty high-tech stuff, including earth-moving equipment, tunneling equipment, airships like we're talking about. Supposedly Atlantis had this stuff too. I talk about in one of my books, Atlantis and the Power System of the Gods, how there was a kind of a Tesla system broadcasting power like Nikola Tesla wanted to do. These airships picked up on this power. And so the idea, too, of going underground, one of my books on that subject is a book called Lost Continents in the Hollow Earth, and it's all about myths and legends and weird stuff, tunneling underground, that kind of a thing. And Mount Shasta fits into that, of course. It's interesting to think of Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, and I'm from Colorado. And Cheyenne Mountain is near Colorado Springs. Everybody in Colorado knows all about it. But here you have what is basically a mountain that's been hollowed out by the U.S. military. Inside that mountain is a city, a military city. It's a secret city in a way. You can't go in there, but the military admits they have it.
Is it a bunker?
What's that?
Is it a bunker for the Illuminati?
Well, it's kind of one of them. Yeah, I mean, they have a whole bunch of this stuff. And, you have this whole underground world around us. We were talking about the Hopi Indians going underground in the Grand Canyon, living with the ant people and stuff like that. I mean, it's a natural thing. And, in fact, underground buildings, underground bases, whatever, these are good places to go during cataclysms, during wars, superstorms and stuff like that. Underground, if you had an underground house, it would maintain a pretty constant temperature, winter or summer. So here you have a mountain like Mount Shasta. I mean, the legends of Mount Shasta are very similar in a way to Cheyenne Mountain near Colorado Springs. You have, with Mount Shasta, the idea that it's hollow, there are tunnels and stuff beneath it. Supposedly, Mount Shasta has some kind of Atlantean city in it. Earlier stories, too, it called it a Lemurian city because it was near the Pacific. UFOs are often seen coming and going out of Mount Shasta. I've been told, actually, by people who work for Boeing that they know certain special things about Mount Shasta, including that the U.S. government has a special radar installations around Mount Shasta to watch the mountain and watch what comes in and out of that mountain. How about that?
Interesting. That is fascinating.
Similar things, too, George, are in South America. And I've spent a lot of time in Peru and Bolivia and other countries in South America. I love going down there. In my book, Lost Continents of Hollow Earth, a lot of that is about the Andes, and my book on Lost Cities and Ancient Mysteries of South America. But there, too, around Lake Titicaca, also around Cusco, there's a special lake, and it's, well known in those areas that UFOs are seen coming out of these lakes, also out of Lake Titicaca. So you have also, apparently, and it seems to be around Lake Titicaca, which is, and that is a giant, huge lake that is half in Bolivia, half in Peru.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Mount Shasta, you have this idea of hollowed-out mountains in the Andes. They are these UFO bases. Some of them also come out of lakes and things like that. The idea there is, and I talk about this in Technology of the Gods and whatnot, my book on Vimana aircraft of ancient Indian Atlantis, that in ancient times, we're talking excess of 10,000 years ago, there was a civilization much like we have today, not a consumer society, the way ours is right now with all these different commercials and different brands of products and things like that. But they had electricity. They had high-tech stuff. They were even beyond what we have, moving giant stones and stuff like that. At some point, because of these, and this is a theory here, because of these cataclysms of the earth, sometimes the earth is destroyed by water, by fire, by ice. This is what the Mayans and Aztecs and Olmecs said. And during these cataclysms of the earth, pole shifts, whatever, I mean, it's devastating. Oceans spill out of their basins and giant tidal waves wash over continents. Every volcano in the world erupts. Giant earthquakes, happen on a worldwide scale.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, what can happen is the earth, falls back into a Stone Age. But there was high-tech stuff. A little bit like New Guinea. If you've ever gone to New Guinea, that is one weird place. I mean, it's kind of like some caveman Neanderthal society. People are running around with stone axes. There's a head-hunting society. But yet, in certain, capital cities there, Qantas jets, land, it's very high-tech, modern world at the airport. But, the rest of New Guinea is living in the Stone Age. So it could be a similar thing here with Mount Shasta and Atlantis, where you have pockets of high technology. They have electricity, hydroelectric plants and stuff, just like we have today. Broadcasting it through towers, like Tesla. Tesla himself envisioned all this stuff in the sky. He was some, I believe, like a reincarnated Atlantean who was basically reinventing what they already had 10,000 years ago.
They might have had higher technology than we have today.
Well, I think that they did, and it was, anti-gravity, it was UFOs, their craft, like these Vimanas and stuff. Some of them did have wings and whatnot, but some of them could, hover like, say, a UFO. But the idea of Mount Shasta here and other areas is that as the world fell apart 10,000 years ago, certain isolated areas, kind of like Edgar Cayce's Hall of Records and things like that, but certain places where these Atlanteans went to and maintained in a secret place some kind of technology. It's been said there's places in Tibet like this, very remote spots where you could have a secret base inside of a mountain like Mount Shasta, where you have your generators running, you park your Vimanas, you've got your gold, you're going to have hydroponic and whatever. Even you can go out perhaps to local towns and things like that and buy things. And that was one of the stories about Mount Shasta, as you probably know, is that particularly around in the late 1800s, these kind of mysterious people would show up at shops in Northern California, and they would buy things with gold nuggets and things like that. And it was believed by people that they were coming out of Mount Shasta.